Now it's a very good transition to Dr. Melanie Saville, who will tell us how and where we are with the vaccines. Melanie, the floor is yours. And thank you for participating.
Thank you, Joris, and thank you for inviting me to give you an update of where we are since May. And I think it's fair to say there's been a huge amount of progress in terms of vaccine development over the last few months, and I will attempt to summarize that in 15 minutes. So if you move straight to the next slide, in this first slide is just to show you that the WHO has put together a target product profile of COVID-19 vaccines. This is the preferred profile. So ideally it would have 70% efficacy, would be a single dose. But there is also a sort of minimum target product profile with an understanding that everyone is moving forward with speed and really looking at where could vaccines be beneficial for COVID-19 with a minimum criteria of 50% efficacy, and obviously allowing two-dose vaccines to be made, especially when we're thinking about a completely new disease that we are trying to protect people from. So the next slide. So this slide represents what we know in terms of globally in how many COVID-19 vaccines are under development currently. So we have actually managed to count through publications, through public announcements, that there are more than 320 vaccines currently being developed against SARS-CoV-2. Many of them are in the clinic, and I'll talk about those in more detail. But you can see here there was a very wide range of vaccine platforms, from the classic inactivated platforms, live attenuated platforms, through to the more new and innovative platforms such as the messenger RNA vaccines. So if you move to the next slide. And this is to show you really how much progress has been made. So we're now in October, just over 9 months since the virus was first sequenced and the sequence was made available. And this slide shows you the number of trials that are currently ongoing with the various candidates. So there are 39 candidates that have already reached clinical testing. Normally in vaccine development, this would take multiple years to get to a stage even of getting into phase 1. And also with that in mind, there are already 10 candidates that are in phase 3 clinical testing. So these really come into 5 different types of categories of vaccines, from viral vectors, which could be anything from the adenovirus type vectors through to measles vectors and many others. I mentioned already RNA, which is obviously a newer and quite novel technology. Also DNA, protein-based vaccines with adjuvants, and the classic inactivated vaccines. You can see here that part of the work that we are doing within CEPI and COVAX, that there are 8 of these are under COVAX, which I will talk about a little bit later. Just to focus on some of the more advanced vaccines here. First of all, to say really mRNA has revolutionized vaccine development. So the very first candidate that got into the clinic was the Moderna mRNA candidate, and it was only 66 days between identification of the sequence and starting a phase 1 clinical trial. And it was, I think, for the first time, the fact that the manufacturing of the material for phase 1 was not the thing on the critical path for moving into the clinic. So with all of these 10 candidates already in phase 2, phase 3 clinical testing, there are some candidates that are now getting very close to first efficacy readouts. So Pfizer today, their RNA candidate Their CEO sent out a letter to explain how they're planning to move towards license. So there are 3 critical areas. The first is the efficacy readout, and they do expect to potentially have enough cases for efficacy readout by the end of this month. The second piece that is critical is safety. And the FDA have set some strict rules as to how much safety data is needed and the duration of follow-up for submitting for emergency use authorization, and they're planning to have enough data for that by the 3rd week in November. And then the fourth piece is clearly having the manufacturing well under control at the scale that you need for licensure, and that is expected to be in the same time frame, which does mean that it is possible before the end of the year that the first regulatory submission for emergency use authorization may be made. Equally, Moderna, who started also very fast, believe that they will have enough clinical data for the first efficacy readouts by the end of November. And AstraZeneca, through their efficacy trials that are ongoing in the UK, South Africa, and Brazil, anticipate having sufficient data for first emergency use authorization submission before the end of the year. So we have to remember these are submissions. They have to be reviewed by the regulators and approved for use. Next slide, please. So I want to then focus on, there's quite now a lot of clinical data available from the early clinical trials, and you'll see on the next slide really just a summary of some of the immunogenicity data that we're beginning to see from the candidates. So currently the candidates have really been tested in adults, and we're beginning to get some data in the elderly as well. And this is just an example of 3 different platforms that have presented data from their phase 1 or phase 1/2 clinical trials. You can see here the Moderna mRNA vaccine here looking at neutralizing antibody, Novavax with their protein and matrix M adjuvant, showing both binding and neutralizing antibody. And then the single dose vaccine from Janssen with the Ad26 vector, again, looking at ELISA and neutralizing data. And what you can see really quite consistently is that the vaccines that have been tested in the clinic do generate binding antibody responses to the spike protein, which is the antigen in all of these vaccines so far, either the full-length spike or the receptor binding domain. There is varying degrees of neutralizing antibody, but neutralizing antibody is being observed in these vaccines. And the cellular immune response is very much Th1 orientated. Some candidates are beginning to show data in the elderly population, and in some instances, as what is often seen with vaccines, the immune response in the elderly is somewhat less than in adults, although we're seeing some candidates with clear, good, strong data in an elderly population. Next slide, please. I don't want to go into any detail. This is really just to make a specific point in terms of our ability to compare the immune response across various different vaccine candidates. You can see here that this is looking at either binding antibody or neutralizing antibody across the various developers that have published data, that they're all using different antigens from different strains. They're using different assays, and they're using different substrates for the assay. So it is very difficult to compare the candidates at this point in time. But as you'll see on the next slide, this is something that we're involved in at CEPI, is really trying to look at having standardized and high quality assays available to all of the developers. So one of the first things, NIBSC are developing antibody reference material and antibody standards that can be used in assays. Also CEPI is developing a network of centralized laboratories that will allow for testing for humoral immune responses, both neutralizing antibody and binding antibody, as well as some cellular antibody assays. And this is currently for any developer who is in phase 1 or phase 1, phase 2 and up to the limit of the budget is free of charge. So anyone here who is a vaccine developer, we welcome the opportunity for you to test your samples through this centralized laboratory network. Next slide. I think this just shows you the network that we have. And on this next slide, really just wanted to summarize what we're seeing so far in the clinic from a safety perspective. So overall, we've seen the reactogenicity profile is generally satisfactory. In some cases, you're seeing increased reactogenicity in the second dose. And there's been no clinically relevant safety signals to date. We do know that several trials have been paused to evaluate safety. This is quite normal in clinical development, that if you see an event close to vaccinations that may require hospitalization, you pause while you look at that. We have not seen evidence so far of vaccine-mediated disease enhancement, and need to think in the long term of continuing to gather safety data. Next slide, please. I won't focus too much on the next couple of slides, but from a efficacy perspective, we now have multiple efficacy trial designs that have been published by the developers. You can see there are some nuances and differences here. In terms of the efficacy trials that are being conducted, they are in adults and the elderly. And you'll see on the next slide that the statistical assumptions and sample sizes are sometimes different across the various studies, either aiming for 60% or 50% efficacy. And what has been really the agreed on lower bound of 30%. And you can see here the various assumptions, meaning that the trial designs are of different sizes, but really sizable number of individuals taking part in these efficacy trials. Next slide, please. So then moving on to a little bit on terms of partnership in the context of vaccine development. And in the next slide, this is something that's really come together, probably came together at the time of the last meeting, but the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, which is led by WHO, is really looking at coordinating activities towards COVID-19 with a pillar on diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. And for vaccines, CEPI is a co-lead of the initiative for vaccines, where CEPI is responsible for R&D and manufacturing, Gavi for procurement and delivery of vaccines, and WHO leading policy and allocation. So if you move to the next slide. So this is showing under the umbrella of COVAX what we are all trying to do. We have developed a largest portfolio of, largest and most diverse portfolio of vaccines. And some of those were represented in the earlier slide. So we have 9 vaccines in development, of which 8 are in clinical trials and 3 in late phase development. And the objective through a coordinated approach is to deliver 2 billion doses of vaccines by the end of 2021. And that those vaccines are distributed in a fair and equitable allocation process to all the countries around the world. Next slide, please. So where we are today, so COVAX has been formed with the portfolio of vaccines that we have, that we hope will deliver the vaccines by the end of 2021. And we now have 181 countries that have joined COVAX to have access to doses of vaccines for their population. And within that 181 countries, 92 of those are low and middle income countries for which there is fundraising for an advanced marketing commitment to ensure that the low and middle income countries have access to vaccines at the same time as the high income countries. So to avoid, you know, a small number of countries having access to the majority of the doses. Next slide, please. The last couple of slides really are going to focus on a little bit on manufacturing, a critical piece we're advancing in terms of of clinical development, but we need to have the scale of manufacturing. And this is just to show you that there are a large number of commitments that have already been made for manufacturing, billions of doses from various manufacturers in bilateral deals, which means a huge amount of scale up of manufacturing, scale out, tech transfer, all around the world to look at potentially providing vaccines. This is in the context that we must realize that not every vaccine candidate is likely to succeed, either from a safety, efficacy, or a manufacturing perspective. So next slide. So this is just showing you indeed the need of looking at a truly global scale in terms of manufacturing, and specifically for COVAX to deliver 2 billion doses of vaccine by the end of 2021. We need several successful candidates. So there's a lot of emphasis on finding the manufacturing capacity, both in terms of drug substance, so making the bulk material, and drug product, so filling the material into vials, labeling the material, and making it available. So a truly global effort. And we have conducted a survey which shows there is the capacity that is available currently to ensure that there could be 2 billion doses of vaccine made available. But the efforts that we'll need to get there are tremendous. Manufacturing vaccines is a highly complex activity. Next slide, please. So these are just my concluding thoughts. So since we last met in May, there's been a huge amount of progress being made. We have data, early clinical trial data from multiple candidates, which is promising. However, we still need to have the first efficacy readouts, but we can expect those now before the end of the year. And manufacturing is already occurring at scale, and tech transfer is beginning. But this is really still only part way through the journey. There are many challenges that we still have to face, especially in the low resource settings. So most of the vaccines that we have in development today are 2-dose vaccines, and we will have to find an efficient way to deliver those. The data currently is focusing on adults and elderly. There are other important populations that do need to have data on how well the vaccines will work in those situations. We have to think of cold chain requirements. I highlighted the mRNAs. These are new and novel technologies, and the cold chain requirements for some of these are actually ultra cold chain. Durability of the immune response and the protection of vaccines is, as of today, unknown and will need to be tested, and whether or not we need boosters. We need to put some effort into pharmacovigilance to ensure that we are monitoring the safety of the vaccines even after they are introduced. And the regulatory burden is huge. Just in COVAX, having 181 countries that need vaccines by the end of 2021 puts a huge burden on regulators for labeling. Is every country going to want to label in its own language, or will there be some pragmatism from the regulators, I think is an important point. And making sure that the infrastructure is available for delivery and introduction of the vaccine is another critical point. So I'll leave it at this. So as I say, huge amount of progress made, but still a long way to go. Thank you for your attention. I think you're on mute.
I was on mute. Thank you very much, Melanie, for this fantastic overview, which in 15 minutes is on itself a huge challenge to try to overview what has been done since the month of May.